And so now I introduce Professor Stephen Barnett and the shadow leader of the opposition, Harriet Harman, who are going to have the debate this evening. Steve?
Thanks, Bill. I just want to add my own congratulations to Robin for not just for tonight's prize, but actually for many years of wise counsel and astute leadership of the BJR. With all due respect to his successors, the world tonight is still not quite right without his dulcet tones introducing it. It's a bit like losing a good friend. A few of us were musing on his radio style before he arrived at an editorial board meeting just this last Monday. And someone said the thing about Robin is that he never gets cross. And someone else who's worked with him said, oh yes, he gets cross. He just never raises his voice. Anyway, he will be much missed and is certainly a worthy winner. I'd also like to add my own thanks to Bill's, to my own head of department, Geoffrey Davies, who from the beginning of this enterprise has been an enthusiastic and stalwart supporter, both organisationally and financially. Each year, Geoffrey and I have this little ritual where he says, I don't suppose the BJR can contribute something to the reception, and I contemplate the BJR's disappearing budget and the wrath of our treasurer, and I stare at my fingernails. And I know that the department's budget is not exactly elastic, so the continuing generosity is much appreciated. If you see someone with a furrowed brow and a calculator after the event, that will be Geoffrey. And also my thanks too, as well as Bill's, to Kate McMillan and Helen Cohen, who every year, with the minimum of fuss and the maximum of efficiency, make sure that the whole evening runs smoothly and that we all do what we're told. And so, to our speaker, who needs very little introduction, but I will anyway. A lawyer who was elected to Parliament in October 1982 and is now the longest-serving female MP in Parliament. In her first period of opposition, she served as Shadow Employment Secretary, Shadow Health Secretary, and Shadow Social Security Secretary. In government, she served as Secretary of State for Social Security, as Solicitor General, and as Leader of the House of Commons. And in the Woman's Hour Power List of the most powerful women in Britain earlier this year, she was voted the 14th most powerful woman. That was one behind J.K. Rowling, but 3 ahead of the actual Secretary of State for Culture, Maria Miller. If reports are correct, that might prove to be a prescient batting order. To give this year's Charles Wheeler Lecture, please welcome Shadow Deputy Prime Minister and the Shadow Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, Harriet Harman.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted and honoured to be here. And first off, many congratulations to Robin Lustig. It was fantastic to see those clips and to hear you speak again, a very worthy winner of this award. And thank you very much indeed for inviting me to give this lecture and to give it here in the University of Westminster. And what a fantastic building and campus you've got here. And I'm here with Helen Goodman, who's the part of our shadow ministerial team. And I've got reason to be grateful for the university because my chief of staff, Aisha Hazarika, is one of your alumni and is indispensable in my office. So all your teaching has been in very good stead. I'm delighted to be introduced by Steve Barnett, who's toiled so long and with such wisdom on the question of media reform. And it's just such a pleasure to work with you, Steve. I think everybody loves Steve, and in the heat of all the controversy, Steve has always got wise words in order to take people forward. It's a real honour, too, to be here with Lady Wheeler at the Charles Wheeler Lecture, which is an important event in the media calendar. And I can absolutely remember all Charles Wheeler's broadcasts down the decades, and just the sight of his furrowed brow and the beady intelligence of his eyes conjured up immediately authority, honesty, depth, and experience. He continued to broadcast right up until his 80s, and I look forward to the day when women in broadcasting as well can continue beyond their 50th birthday into their 80s. As has been said, Charles Wheeler was respected by all for the best qualities that he showed in broadcast journalism. And as Robin set forth, and nobody here is going to be in any doubt about the importance of journalism, the medium for debate without which our democracy couldn't function, holding power to account. It's a bit less dangerous in the lobby in Westminster than it is in the Democratic Republic of Congo, holding power to account, though, wherever, informing and entertaining, telling us, as you say, about ourselves and the world in which we live. Great journalism requires great tenacity and commitment, and often requires great courage. But this year's Charles Wheeler lecture comes at a time when, still in the aftermath of the public revulsion at the revelation of the hacking of Millie Dowler's phone, people are questioning the values and ethics of journalism. And this was what led up to the Leveson inquiry being set up, then cross-party talks, Parliament's approval of a draft Royal Charter to establish a new press complaints regime, and then the press putting forward their own draft Royal Charter. And we're yet to get to the end of that process. But the draft Royal Charter, supported by the victims of press intrusion and approved by Parliament, provides the complaint system which is long overdue and poses no threat to the freedom of the press. And it's ironic that when we're talking about news reporting, hostile reporting about the draft Royal Charter has fostered a number of myths, and I want to explode some of those myths today. First, it is constantly referred to as press regulation, the Royal Charter and the framework it establishes. It is not regulation. It's redress for those who complain about breaches by the press of their own code. So can we please be accurate and refer to it as a press complaints system and not press regulation? Second, it's attacked for being born out of a stitch-up in discussions from which the press were excluded. Not true. There were extensive discussions with the press. Government ministers met the press numerous times, and many more times. They met the press many more times than they met the victims of press intrusion. And looking back at my diary, it's clear that I had many meetings with the victims of press intrusion, including Hacked Off, and a number of their representatives are here today, and I make no apology for that. But actually, I had even more meetings with newspapers, with editors and proprietors. And during those discussions, we sought to work through how we could make the Leveson proposals work in practice, neither gold-plating them nor watering them down. The third myth is that press concerns about Leveson's report were ignored. Not true. Leveson proposed the recognition system be set up in statute, and we supported that, but the press didn't want that. So the government proposed a royal charter instead, and despite our misgivings, we accepted that. And there were many other changes, such as in the arbitration system and the responsibility for the code, changes that the press called for and were actually made. The fourth myth is that it involves political interference in the press. Far from it. And I think, there's an absolute aversion to that from all sides of the House of Commons. No parliamentarian has called for political interference in the press. And we went to great lengths in the framework to keep ministers and Parliament out of the process. And that's what Leveson's proposals actually did. Under the terms of the draft Royal Charter, politicians are banned from serving on the recognition panel or serving on the board of the independent self-regulator. Once the Charter has been sealed by the Privy Council, to prevent ministers meddling with it, it can't be changed except by a 2/3 majority of both Houses of Parliament. So those are all things to kind of keep politics out of changing the system or being involved in the system. The fifth myth is that it's designed for national papers and threatens local papers. In fact, Leveson specifically provides that if they want, local papers can set up their own regulator or have different arrangements within the national regulator. So the draft Royal Charter framework protects journalistic standards, protects the public, and protects the freedom of the press. Now, this is a very controversial issue over which there have been heated and divisive arguments for decades. So I think it is highly significant that all the party leaders agreed on the draft Royal Charter and brought it to Parliament, and it's highly significant that it was then endorsed unanimously by Parliament on the 18th of March. But we're not at the end of the road of what is a complex and Byzantine process of a Royal Charter. And the situation has been complicated by the fact that while the government were ironing out the last technicalities of the Charter approved by Parliament before sending it off to the Privy Council, a section of the newspaper industry, Pressboff, submitted to the Privy Council their own proposals for a Royal Charter. The Privy Council can only consider one charter on any one issue at one time. And as the Pressboff draft Royal Charter was the first one to be submitted, the Privy Council must follow due process and must have the space to do that. The Privy Council has now consulted on the Pressboff draft Royal Charter, and we await their decision and hope the government will have the opportunity to submit the parliamentary Royal Charter to the Privy Council next in due course. We don't yet know if and when the Privy Council will turn its attention to the draft Royal Charter approved by Parliament, but we hope it will be soon, because Parliament resolved in March for it to go to the Privy Council in May, which of course has yet to happen. But if and when it's approved, this will then be the process. The Royal Charter will be sealed by the Privy Council. Then the Commissioner for Public Appointments will appoint an appointments committee. Sorry, I should have had a flow chart here, perhaps with the Queen somewhere on it. So the Commissioner of Public Appointments will appoint an appointments committee. That appointments committee will appoint the members of the recognition panel. It will then be up to the press to propose an independent self-regulatory body or bodies which match up to the recognition criteria in the Royal Charter. If within 12 months of the Royal Charter being sealed, not all significant news publishers are part of the system, the recognition panel will have to report that to Parliament and to the public. If within 15 months of the Royal Charter being sealed there's no regulator at all, the recognition panel will have to report that to Parliament and the public. So that's the complaint system. But while the sense of impunity, which came from the lack of a proper press complaint system, was a key part of the problem, so too was the sense of invincibility that came with too much newspaper power concentrated in the hands of one man and the lack of proper regulation to guard against media monopoly. And that was also within Leveson's terms of reference. The malpractice and illegality exposed by the Leveson inquiry was never just one rogue reporter or a few corrupt public officials. It was a symptom of an underlying problem, the power that comes from monopoly ownership. Before the News of the World closed, Murdoch owned newspapers with 37% of national circulation, 2 of the most influential dailies and 2 of the most influential Sunday papers. And that is too much power in one man's hands. And had it not been for the hacking scandal, his bid for the whole of B-Sky B would have been waved through. But this isn't just about Rupert Murdoch. It's about guarding against monopoly, promoting the principle of plurality, and having proper regulation for a media world where there is massive change and convergence between newspapers, broadcasting, and social media. Preventing monopoly is important in any commercial area for all the reasons we know about, such as protecting against new entrants being obstructed from getting into the market. But there's an even greater imperative over and above the usual objections to monopoly when it comes to the media. Because the media is about communication and exchange of information in our democracy. The concentration of unaccountable media power distorts the political system. The free flow of information of different points of view is crucial for open debate. The availability of a diverse range of views is important to each and every citizen. But if you have a concentration of power, you have a small number of people have too much control over the political agenda, over the public policy debate, over political decision-making. What makes media monopoly different from others is that the media plays a role in representing politicians to the public in a way that influences their votes. When a media company grows too big, it has the ability to trade policy influence for favourable coverage, which is damaging to our democracy. So too much power in too few hands hinders proper debate. Plurality ensures that no media owner can exert too much influence on public opinion and on policymakers. It ensures that no media company can have so much influence that it feels itself invincible above even the rule of law. It ensures no private interest can set itself above the public interest. But we don't have a proper regime for protecting against monopoly. The inadequacies and complexities of the system were laid bare by the News Corps bid for the whole of B-Sky B. And the system is out of date. This is an age of great change in the media where we have print, newspapers, broadcasters, media and new media and a convergence of all three. And everyone agrees the system doesn't work and is out of date and that this is a problem, which has been there for some time and which must be addressed now. And this includes the Prime Minister. In the House of Commons in July 2011, after the revelation of Millie Dowler's phone being hacked, he said, "To address the vexed issue of media power, we need competition policy to be properly enforced. We need a sensible look at the relevance of plurality and cross-media ownership. Above all, we need to ensure that no one becomes too powerful." And we agree with him. And we feel it would be best for us to go about this, as we did with press complaints, on a completely cross-party basis. So, she's not here in the audience, but I make this offer to the Culture Secretary, Maria Miller, and call on her to establish a process that brings the political parties together, that engages with the media industry and experts, and frames proposals for new regulation which should form part of a new Communications Act. And this process needs to be transparent, objective, and have integrity. There are a number of key issues that this process should address about ownership within media sectors, as well as cross-media ownership. We favour clear, bright lines. A lower ownership limit below which there would be no issue. An upper limit beyond which it would not be possible to go and there would need to be divestment. And a clear, non-discretionary regulatory regime of obligations, such as measures to bolster editorial independence, independent governance, duties to promote plurality, for those media organisations which fall in the middle band between the lower level and the upper limit. So lower limit, no problem. Middle band, non-discretionary, regulated according to clear criteria. Above the upper limit, not possible. And there's already been a great deal of thinking on this. Ender's analysis have proposed a 15% cross-media limit, which would include any medium of communication that stands between a creator of content and an audience. Avaz has proposed 20% as the upper limit for ownership within any one sector, while the NUJ has put forward a limit of 25% across media sectors and within each media sector. Whatever the figures arrived at, we'll need agreement on a clear measurement methodology. You know, there's no one perfect answer, but we need to agree what is the clear measurement. that includes also a recognition of the important influence of new media players online. This process, which I'm proposing, will also need to agree when those judgments about share are made, not just as now, when there's an event such as a merger, but by continuous market monitoring. And the process will need to agree remedies that will need to be applied when those limits are exceeded. Clear limits and a non-discretionary regime for the middle band will remove the temptation for media organisations to pressurise ministers and the regulator and to tie them up in litigation. The process should also agree on the question of the fit and proper person test. We think it's currently, well, indefined and narrow and needs to be properly defined, so it clearly includes impropriety and failures of good governance, as well as criminal convictions. And the process should take particular account of the different circumstances that obtain at a local level, both broadcast and print. Local newspapers are very important indeed. And when we're talking about diversity and plurality, we've got to think not just of diversity and plurality at a national level, but actually the plurality that comes with having a strong local media as well as a strong national media. Local reporting is important, keeping people in touch with local events in their community, keeping people informed about important local issues through reporting, and holding local democracy to account. It's 10 years since Parliament last decided on any of these issues with the Communication Act, the first Communication Act 2003. That was before Facebook, let alone Twitter. It seems extraordinary to think that that was the case, and extraordinary that that act didn't even use the word internet. So fast has been the pace of change. And of course, it's only accelerating, so our framework must be future-proof. And though it's all very challenging and complex, it mustn't be left or just put in the too difficult box. And above all, we'll not make progress if we allow the political parties to divide on this issue. We simply won't. We should work together to make sure that the freedom of debate in the democracy which we all care about is protected, so that British people get the British democracy, so British democracy and the British people has the media it needs, the media it deserves, and a media which will be very different from the world in which Charles Wheeler operated, but where the values that he embodied would make him proud of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harriet. I think we're on radio mics now. So now, Harriet's agreed, as is traditional, to take a few questions. We'll have maybe 15 minutes where anyone who has anything they want to say, either about what she said today or any other issues of media policy. I'm going to ask one question to give everyone a chance to think about what question they want to ask. I can see one question already at the back. Let me ask one question, Harriet, on your sense of optimism or otherwise. As you know, it's taken an enormous effort to get to where we are on press regulation, to get all the parties working together. In no small part, I have to say, due to your own efforts. But we are now less than 2 years away from a general election. General elections concentrate the minds of political parties about the prospect of power. And that means not wanting to alienate media barons. Is it really going to be possible to get parties to work together, bury their differences on something as delicate as ownership and cross-ownership?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, I never thought I'd see the day when we would be working when Ed Miliband would be working with Nick Clegg and with the Prime Minister to agree a press complaint system. I absolutely, I didn't think that we'd see that day. And I think that this is an unprecedented moment. And so I think that you're absolutely right, that general elections are by definition divisive. I mean, we're going to see not only a division between the government and us, but we're going to see a division between the two different parts of the coalition government. I mean, it's all about explaining your difference. It's the opposite of all agreeing. And you're absolutely right that that's the time when people fear falling out of favour with the press because of all the issues that we all know about. So it is very difficult, but I absolutely do think that the hacking revelations, coming as they did in the middle of the Murdoch attempted takeover of B Sky B, have created that opportunity. And I think we have got plenty of other things to argue about. We can argue about the economy and the health service. We're not going to be short of things to be absolutely kicking hell out of each other on. And I think we should just make this one that we do for democracy and just actually get this sorted out. And I think that would be a really important and honourable thing for everybody to resist the temptation for kicking the hell out of each other and actually do the right thing. So I am optimistic about it.
And it can be done in 23 months?
I think that we have to get the process started right away. And I think that we've got... we've actually setting up a way of working, and once you've set up a way of working, you can feed the process into it. It has created a dynamic where we can actually work together on the basis of, quite a lot of trust. And it has changed that dynamic. So I think if we can keep it separate, keep that dynamic going, we don't have to create it, I think we certainly can.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Right, let's have some questions. We've got two microphones. I think I'm right in saying there's a question there and one there, and we've got one there and one there. So, wherever the microphone's got to, is there just one mic? Mic's up there. Okay, let's go. Could you say who you are, and if you're representing any organisation or anyone, please say who.
Okay, my name's Laura Cox.
We can't hear you, sorry.
Sorry, my name is Laura Cox. And I wondered, I was very interested when you said you look forward to the day when more women over 50 stay in journalism, which I think is probably something we'd all like. And I just wondered why you think it is that older women find themselves turning away from the industry, and what you think we can actually do to change that.
Okay, let's take another. We'll wait for the microphone to come down there, and let's have someone on this. I will take two questions. Yep.
Hi, Harriet. Following the successful...
Sorry, can you say who you are?
Hi, I'm Fran. I work at Hacked Off, and I also campaign against Page 3. Following the really successful No More Page 3 campaign and the women's group submissions at Leveson, I just want to know what next for us all. Caroline Lucas did very well in Parliament yesterday. Ed Vaizey poo-pooed everything she said. And I just want to know what we're going to do about the state of women's representation in the press at the moment.
Okay, let's deal with those sort of related. Well, maybe not quite. And then can we make sure the microphones are with the next questions, please? Right, how to keep older women in journalism?
Well, not chuck them out of journalism once they get to 50 and have a few grey hairs. I think that we've set up an older women's commission, and we did a survey of the broadcast organisations. It was very interesting because below 50, they've got actually a pretty completely accurate representation in terms of presenters of the population below 50 and above 50. And below 50, they've got equal numbers of men and women. So they're kind of spot on reflecting back to people who is watching the telly. When it gets to over 50, though, it suddenly changes. And that it's more than 80% men and only 20% women. And it's not because those women weren't there before, it's because they get kind of pushed out. And I think there's been a culture of expecting that if a woman is not looking like she's in her sort of, you know, reproductive heyday, that she's a frightening sight, and that God help us if we see a wrinkly neck, it will turn the viewers to stone, and therefore they must be protected from the sight of an older woman. And actually, as an older woman myself, I think this is very rude. I think there's nothing frightening or objectionable about older women, and they shouldn't be, you know, hushed, you know, moved away from the screen when they get to over 50. And I think it's, you know, insidious discrimination, and actually, to their credit, the broadcasters actually having responded to the survey, and they could have just told us to shove off and not given us the information. It was good that the BBC gave a lead, so we were able to say the BBC's given us this information and come clean. And they all gave us the information. It was very good. And they all actually are sitting down, nearly really thinking about how they can change it. George Entwistle said on that one of his woeful Radio 4 interviews, when somebody asked him about this, he said, "Oh, we'll have to go out looking for older women." But actually, they're all being employed. They're just being got rid of once they get to be older. So I'm really hopeful that we can make some progress. When we were chasing out one of the bits of the survey, because somebody hadn't replied, they said, "We haven't replied yet, because we've got one person, we're waiting, she's 49. We're waiting for her to turn 50, and then we're going to fill in the form." So she's now a trophy, as opposed to being somebody who was obviously on her way out. Now, about page 3, you know, I think page 3 is something that we can just have our views about and speak about and protest about, and I certainly think that the aspirations for women should be a bit higher than standing in your knickers with your no top on page 3 of The Sun. I think it's absolutely ridiculous and ludicrous, and but I don't think it should be banned, and I think we should protest against it and say no more page 3, but I don't think we should pass a law against it. That's what I think. I think it should be banned by The Sun themselves. Well, I just think that we just have to, campaign and protest until they actually see sense. Interestingly, none of the editors would like to see their daughters on page 3, or their wives or their sisters. I mean, it's absolute, double standards. But I don't think it should be, And the way we sort out women's representation in journalism and the press is actually by having a balanced team of men and women in the press, so that it's not being women represented by men.
Okay. I think Murdoch himself tweeted at one point that he was beginning to think it was a bit old-fashioned.
Yeah, but he didn't do anything about it.
I was going to say, nothing happened. Right, we've got a question there, and then and the microphone's there. Yep, excellent. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, I'm Eve Salomon. I was interested in your discussion about plurality and the figures that you were banding around. And I was wondering, given the fact that, for example, the BBC has over 50% radio share, how you would treat the BBC, and if you would exclude it from the plurality figures, what arguments you would use against critics of that exclusion.
Okay, and let's have the question. Any hands for more questions? I can't believe that's all. Okay, we have one up there. Right, okay, let's have the question here.
My name's Liz Howell, I'm from City University. I'd just like to make a very quick point before I get to my question, which is that I'm very interested in your statistics about the presenters. We've been doing a lot of research in a campaign called Expert Women, and one of the things we've discovered is that although you do have more women presenters under 50, perhaps equal to the numbers of men, they present a different type of programme. They don't present or appear on the significant news and current affairs group of programmes as the men. So that's just a point of information. My question, though, is like Eve's about the plurality. Where do you put groups like Google when you look at plurality, and Facebook and Twitter, obviously, but Google in particular?
Okay, 2 questions on plurality. What do you do with the BBC, and what do you do with the big news aggregators and social media?
I think the thing about the BBC is that it has a different regime. It has the charter, it has the agreement, it has the licence fee, which actually provides a very big level of requirement in terms of the public purposes that don't apply to newspapers, for example. So the BBC, for example, has to have as one of its objectives sustaining citizenship and civil society, promoting education and learning, stimulating creativity and cultural excellence. It is highly, its objectives are set very clearly within that regulatory framework. And obviously there is charter renewal, and when that comes up, then these issues are rethought of. But there is a very clear and separate regime for the BBC. And yeah, the issue of online news and content, and the question of bloggers and those reporting, well, we have to find an agreed methodology, a sort of metrics, which can actually make sense for how things are operating at the time. But they will no doubt have to be changed as things that we can't even envisage now then become absolutely pervasive in terms of different ways of communication. But I think that just because it's ever changing and just because it's difficult doesn't mean that you shouldn't actually do it. And if you think about the newspapers as well, obviously they're in a very challenging climate because of all the new media. But just because they are in a challenging climate and it's affecting their bottom line doesn't mean that they aren't very influential still, and therefore that it isn't a problem that they have there's a monopoly ownership within newspapers.
I'll come back to that in a minute, if I may. There was a question there, and there's a question here. Yes, if you have your question, what was it?
Alan Morrison. On media plurality as well, you mentioned setting up a cross-party process. There's the law, as you probably know, the Lord Select Committee on Communications has underway an inquiry into media plurality, which itself is clearly a cross-party process. I was wondering how, just procedurally, you think that might feed in. And if I can have a second one, just that's a sort of technical question. Curious on the bright line limits. Some people criticise them for being too crude because of the way that they might penalise those who have interests outside news and current affairs. ITV, should it be, for example, prevented from acquiring a news and current affairs provider because of the success of Downton Abbey?
Sorry.
Now let's go with that, because I think you should say who you are, Alan.
Sorry, I probably should declare a slight interest in as much as I am personally the policy analyst to the Lord Select Committee on Communications. But those two questions I ask as a sort of independently interested person. That's fine. I maybe am a little bit of a ringer.
No, I don't want to be accused of not doing my job properly. Right. Let's talk about that, because I think Alan's concern was procedurally, where does your initiative fit in with the House of Lords Select Committee inquiry, which kicked off this week, and then you were particularly concerned about the white lines issue and penalising success.
In particular, given the fact that, well, as some people would argue, I'm just neutral here obviously, but as some people would argue, they might penalise those who have interests outside news and current affairs. So if our concern is about the influence of providers of news and current affairs, how do you limit the way that you measure?
Okay. Sorry, I misunderstood. I thought. Well, there is also the issue about penalising success, but let's start with the procedural thing, and then.
Well, I mean, I think that the work of the Lords Select Committee will be very important in feeding into the process I'm suggesting. And of course, there's been previously under Lord Putnam, Commons Lords Joint Committee. There's been a lot of work, good work that's done in this area on a parliamentary basis, but it needs to move into a kind of government actual action basis. So really it's just a question of the parliamentary process, including the Commons Select Committee, feeding into a process which is going to end up in some legislation rather than just recommendations. So I think that, you know, this is going to be very good work. And, you know, if Maria Miller were to set up this sort of process, it would give an incredible impetus to the work that's going to be very good that the Lords are going to be undertaking anyway. Whenever you are dealing with monopoly, you've got to deal with the issue about aren't you penalising success? But you just simply cannot allow somebody to be growing so large that actually they then have too much power, and then that interferes with, you know, with the ability of there to be diversity and new entrants into that market. It's the same argument on monopoly as there is for, you know, for any sector. And, you know, of course, how you measure it is difficult and technical, and there will be, you know, quite difficult and complex and technical discussions about it. But it doesn't mean there is no complete right answer waiting to be discovered, but there's just got to be a process whereby we, instead of saying we know something needs to be done, but oh, it's all too difficult, we can't agree on doing it, that we just leave this moment and let it pass by when everybody agrees it's a problem.
Okay, I mean, I think there is an implicit question there about whether we should concentrate only on news and current affairs or whether plurality is a bigger issue, which I think is actually important, but maybe we'll save that for the drinks. I've got my fellow BJR board member, Ivor, and then who else would like to? We've got one there. I think after that we might draw it to a close. One there. Okay, let's take those three and then draw it to a close.
Ivor Gaber. Listening to Harriet's proposals on cross-media ownership and controls, which I'm very sympathetic to, and seeing Steve sitting next to you reminds me of a time, he knows exactly what I'm going to say, before, when Labour was in opposition and there was a thing called a Media Policy Advisory Group, or whatever our name was. You were not involved, you had other responsibilities, but we came up with some really interesting, exciting proposals, not a million miles from yours, and were told, and the words were, I think, Steve, Rupert won't wear it. Can you give us an assurance that as we go forward, those words, whether it's Rupert or any other media magnate won't wear it, will not influence, again, Labour Party policy?
Well, are you talking about in the 80s? Was this? Yeah.
No, it was 90s. It was 1995.
Oh, right.
It was
95.
1995, just before
I think we're in a different, you know, we're in a different situation. The reality is that all those years of concerns that people had, but a sense that actually nothing could be done about it, the sense that it was wrong, that it was damaging, that it was undemocratic, but that nothing could be done about it, changed with the public mood changing, the Millie Dowler, you know, with the Millie Dowler revelations changing the phone hacking, and also, to his credit, Ed Miliband saying, you know, what previously had always never been thought that anybody could say, since Neil Kinnock said it in 1988, and for his pains got hammered every day of his leadership ever since, to actually say this is not okay and something's got to be done about it, and actually, you know, instead of just wringing his hands in private, demanding that an inquiry be set up, you know, and to his credit, David Cameron responding and agreeing to it. So I think it just is very different. We've never got as far as we've got before on this. So that's why we've got to press on until it's done.
And in terms of the Labour Party, do you think that the Rupert won't wear its mantra will never be heard again?
It's not the way we're doing things.
But
No.
just to follow up on Ivor's question, is that because there is more of a cross-party approach to or you want there to be more of a cross-party approach, or is it because Labour is itself going to be more determined?
Well, it's because the opportunity is here in a way that there hasn't been, and in the face of that opportunity, we're going to be very determined. I mean, I remember the times in the run-up to the 97 election, when, you know, there were those discussions about whether or not, bearing in mind we'd been so long in opposition since 1979, and so many problems as we saw it had happened in the country since as a result of us being out of power. And was that just, there were so many things we wanted to do on the health service, on schools and childcare and employment, that actually taking on the issue of media monopoly was just going to stop us getting into government, and it was just not a battle which we felt we could take on and win. And, you know, a decision was made, which Tony Blair referred to in his Feral Beasts speech. And, you know, that was a very disappointing decision to have to make, but, you know, it was felt to be right at the time, but we're in different times now.
Okay, I think we've got 2 more questions, and then we're going to wrap up. There was one round here, you got the microphone, and there was one over there, and I think then we'll wind up. Yeah.
What's your latest...
Sorry, who are
Sorry,
you?
my name's Rachel Rouse. I work for a company called Tetra Strategy. What's your latest intel, perhaps from Dan Jarvis, on the potential scrapping of the DCMS? And were that to happen, what do you think that could mean for the future of media reform?
I think that's a really good question. And then the last question.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jelena from University of Westminster, and I wanted to ask, when you talk about cross-media ownership rules, do you only talk about the national level? And what about local cross-media ownership? Because Ofcom a few years sort of removed the restrictions on local cross-media ownership. They saw the monopoly at the local level, the only way for the local and community media to survive.
That's a really good question as well. Let's take that question first, Harriet, because you mentioned at the end of your speech the local press. How different should the ownership regime be at the local level? Don't we need local monopolies to some extent?
Well, we certainly need to think about how we can support the local press, and one of the things that we could do is look to whether or not one of the things that could be done within that regime in the middle band, where if you're above the lower band but below the upper band, that you're going to have public obligations. One of those could be an obligation to find ways of supporting the local press. So I think that, you know, that is a difficult issue, and one we've got to be aware of, and I don't think there's any immediate pat answer on that. But I think in a way, when we went into the process of Leveson and then the cross-party talks, there weren't tablets of stone that were there and that we just literally dug up. There was a process which led to an outcome, and we knew what the principles were we needed to secure. And I think it's going to be the same on that. And, you know, one of the things that is important is the issue of local reporting as well. As far as the question of the DCMS is concerned, I think, you know, I think it would be a massive shame if the DCMS were to be disbanded, but I think it's already being very run down, which is why there is a concern that the next fate that might befall it is to be sort of all its functions broken up and put into all different departments. I think that the things that are in the DCMS are a first order issue for the DCMS. If they were split up and put into health, then, you know, the primary focus of the health department is, you know, any bits that went into health, you know, the primary focus of the health department, you know, is going to be hospitals and GPs, and you know, if bits were put into education, the primary focus there would be, you know, schools, and therefore it would be always a sort of number 15 on the Secretary of State's list of priorities, whereas when you've got the department itself, that is the number 1 issue for that Secretary of State, you know, with their feet under the cabinet table. So it does give a focus, which breaking it all up doesn't. And if you think about, I do think that the momentum that came from having the department with the Olympics, it's hard to think about how it might have all been, you know, coordinated successfully and so ambitiously if it didn't have its own department. So I think it would be wrong, and it would send the wrong message, because the reality is that, you know, arts, culture, the creative industry are very important for this country. We're good at it. It generates jobs and growth, as well as being important intrinsically for all the things that arts and culture provide. So I'm hoping at the moment, my intel, my gut instinct at the moment is feeling a bit more positive today. Yesterday I was convinced it was for the chop in the public spending review as a way of the government saying that they were actually going to save money, although I'm not sure that sloughing off the functions does actually save money. But I'm feeling a bit more hopeful rather than less today. What do you think? Do you think it would be a problem if there was no DCMS, Department of Culture, Media and Sports? Or would you like to see the back of it?
I think that it would, you know, degrade the. I think it would degrade the sectors that it represents and suggest that Britain doesn't think that culture is as important. You know, there's obviously a lot going on with the education reform as well that looks at whether culture's being prioritised enough, and I think that that would work negatively alongside that.
All right, Steve, go on. But one very last question. Before can we have the microphone down here? Since we have an eminent independent producer here. While the microphone's making its way, can I just confirm, Harriet, that is a firm commitment from the Labour Party that should this government decide that to save money the DCMS has to go, that the Labour Party will resuscitate it if it comes to government at the next election?
We don't think they should abolish it, but actually we don't know whether or not we're having a big policy review which will look at the machinery of government. We might have a different configuration of government departments, but we will have as central the whole issues of culture, arts and the creative industries. So, I mean, I can't give a blueprint of what our proposals will be, even if they don't make any changes. We might be making some machinery of government changes across various different departments, which might affect boundaries and borders, but we would absolutely make sure that it was central, whatever the outcome was. And, you know, our record stands for what we did when we were in government. I mean, you know, it massively grew in importance, you know, with the responsibilities that it took forward from when it was just regarded as the Ministry of Fun, and it was then, you know, massively much more central.
Okay, very last question.
Actually, I think...
say who you are.
Steve Morrison, All3 Media. I think Harriet actually overlapped with what I was going to ask in her last answer, which is the weakness of the DCMS an opportunity to make the concentration on the cultural and creative industries in government bigger rather than smaller? What I mean by that is when you go to France or Germany, you find the concentration of economic and cultural attention and the investment is much greater than this country. We are very little Englander in the way we think of what we do. We don't really understand what other similar countries in Europe are doing. So my question would be, is this not an opportunity for you to look again at the cultural and economic concentration that the creative industries brings to Britain and make the department focus bigger rather than smaller?
So can we actually have a bigger DCMS?
No, it doesn't need to be a DCMS. It may be a combination of what goes on in the DCMS and BIS, focused on the cultural and creative industries?
Okay.
Well, I think, you know, all of these things are very important to think about, and, you know, obviously there's a wider discussion, but, you know, we haven't reached our conclusions, which anyway we will be discussing widely, but we will do before 2015. But, you know, I absolutely take your arguments, and, you know, I think the trouble is that what happens, I think it was a bit like, you know, before we got into government in 1997, you know, the health service had been allowed to get into such a bad state with waiting lists of more than 2 years that everybody said, is there any point? Not everybody, but lots of people were saying, the big question now is there any point in the health service? And then actually, if you run something down, people then challenge it. And I think that's what's happened to the DCMS, is that, you know, it's been stripped away of so many of its civil servants. You know, I don't think Maria Miller is giving it sort of fighting leadership, which is what it actually needs in order to be self-confident. And so I think that, you know, that shouldn't allow us to forget or lose sight of what it could and should be doing just because it is actually struggling at the moment.
Okay. That was a terrific speech, and thank you very much for answering those questions. As I said, Harriet's actually, I've been involved in a few of the meetings, but has really played a central role in that cross-party coalition on media policy. In a way, I mean, I've been involved in media policy issues for 30 years, and I have never seen that kind of cross-party cooperation before. So while I might be a little less optimistic that something could be done in 23 months, I have to say that if anyone can pull it together or help to pull it together, then Harriet can. Can we thank her very much for that?
Thank you.